If you are preparing for a VBAC, I have put together a free guide to help you in your preparation. It's called Preparing for a VBAC, your first 3 steps to an empowered birth experience. This guide will walk you through the first 3 steps that you need to make on your VBAC preparation journey, and it'll make the whole process a lot easier and more straightforward for you. So if you want to grab that guide, go to thehannahgill.com/first steps. Again, that is thehannahgill.com/first steps. Hey there. So today I want to talk about a topic that is probably one of the most common brought up in the VBAC space, and that is interpregnancy or interdelivery intervals from your C-section to your VBAC. So how long should you wait after your C-section to get pregnant in order to have a successful VBAC or in order to decrease your chance of uterine rupture? So I want to talk a little bit about that today. I'm your host, Hannah Gill, and this is Motherhood Flow. So first, I want to define interpregnancy interval versus interdelivery interval. Interpregnancy interval is going to be the time from the first birth to the next pregnancy. So from the time you give birth to when you get pregnant again. And then interdelivery interval is from one birth to the next. So the time between your C-section and the actual VBAC itself. And I do want to state first, if you're following ACOG's guidelines, so this is the overall general interpregnancy interval recommendations from ACOG for any pregnancy and birth, not just talking about C-section and VBAC. So they state on their website, women should be advised to avoid interpregnancy intervals shorter than 6 months and should be counseled about the risks and benefits of repeat pregnancy sooner than 18 months. Most of the data from observational studies in the United States would suggest a modest increase in risk of adverse outcomes associated with intervals of less than 18 months and more significant risk of adverse outcome with intervals of less than 6 months between birth and the start of the next pregnancy. So this is saying for any pregnancy, any type of birth, there's increased risk of adverse outcomes less than 6 months and then less than 18 months, with the greatest risk being getting pregnant less than 6 months postpartum. They go on to state, more recent studies, however, have called into question the methodologies common to much of the literature, and the question remains open as to the causal effect of short interpregnancy intervals on some outcomes. Interdelivery, from one delivery to the next, intervals of less than 18 months have been associated with increased risk of uterine rupture among women undergoing trials of labor after cesarean. Interpregnancy intervals of greater than 5 to 10 years also may be associated with increased risk of adverse outcomes. Okay, so this is just saying that, again, not just for VBAC and C-section, but for any sort of pregnancy and birth, these are the recommended timelines. Now, when it comes to VBAC specifically, there are recommendations. Obviously, interdelivery intervals less than 18 months, there is an increased risk of uterine rupture. Less than 6 months, there's an even greater increased risk of uterine rupture if you become pregnant less than 6 months after your C-section or less than 18 months after, less than 9 months after your C-section. So interdelivery intervals of less than 18 months have been associated with increased risk of uterine rupture among women undergoing trials of labor after cesarean. Now, these are the guidelines put forth by ACOG and the recommendations from them. And I've spoken to multiple women whose providers have given different answers, essentially. So my provider said 18 months from birth to birth, so interdelivery interval. And then I talked to other women who've said their providers have said 18 months birth to conception, so interpregnancy interval. So really there is inconsistency across the board between providers and what they're going to recommend. And I do know women who have given birth in hospitals to VBACs that were less than 18 months after their C-section. So one of my clients had a VBAC 15 months after her C-section, so she basically got pregnant right at 6 months postpartum. And then I've also heard and read stories from women who have had basically Irish twins from their C-section to their VBAC. So they got pregnant within the first 3 to 6 months before or after their C-section. So based on the provider you go to, and depending on your state and the hospital, and even individual providers in the same practice, you may get a different answer. But overall, the data and the recommendations are stating that, okay, at least wait 6 months to decrease your risk of uterine rupture the most. After that, okay, at least wait 9 months to decrease your chance of uterine rupture a little bit more. And then if you want to decrease your chance of rupture overall the most, wait 18 months before getting pregnant again. And it's really going to be what feels best to you, what feels most aligned with the type of birth you're wanting, with how you want your family to be spaced, and what you feel comfortable with. So for me, I didn't get pregnant until 19 months after my C-section, but that had nothing to do with uterine rupture risk. It just, we didn't want our babies close together. That's just something that we personally wanted to do. Some people want their babies back to back, and that is okay, as long as you understand that what timelines you're following, the chances of uterine rupture for you and what that looks like. And if you notice, the recommendations from ACOG for inter-pregnancy and inter-delivery intervals are the same between VBAC patients and non-VBAC patients. They just make it explicit and state that prior to 18 months postpartum, if you get pregnant prior to that, your chance of uterine rupture increases, and it increases a little bit more, even so if you get pregnant before 6 months postpartum. So it's still the same recommendation. They just make a caveat about uterine rupture risk based on the timeline. So even if you're a second-time mom and your first birth was a vaginal birth, I'll read the recommendation again. It still says women should be advised to avoid inter-pregnancy intervals shorter than 6 months and should be counseled about the risks and benefits of repeat pregnancy sooner than 18 months. That is for all births and pregnancy types. So if you are trying to figure out how far after your C-section you want to become pregnant for your VBAC, or if you got pregnant super fast after your C-section, talk to your provider, of course, get their recommendations. But as you can see, there's a lot of inconsistency between providers on what they're telling patients. So they're either telling them 18 months birth to birth or 18 months birth to conception. And that's based loosely on ACOG guidelines, but there is some inconsistency there. So do what feels best for you and for your family and what you want your family to look like. Just make sure you're understanding the risks and benefits of the certain timelines you follow, and do what feels best to you, and know that there are women who have had VBACs within a year of their C-section, within 18 months of their C-section, within 5 years of their C-section, and have not had uterine rupture complications. Just understand the risks and the benefits and do what feels best to you. Trust your gut and your intuition. Take other people's recommendations and advice as counsel, but ultimately look into yourself to figure out what decision feels best to you. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you could please do me a favor when you have a chance, please share this podcast somewhere. Share it with a friend, a family member, share it to social media, because that's the way this podcast grows and more women and more families get the support and the information that they need. And people who just like listening to positive birth stories or certain types of professionals and experts, share this podcast with them. Also, please leave a rating or review, a written review, whatever podcast platform you're listening on. I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Until next time, keep flowing. You just finished another episode of Motherhood Flow. For more, head over to thehannahgill.com or on Instagram @thehannahgill. As a reminder, this podcast is provided to you for educational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered a substitute for medical advice. Until next time, keep flowing.